carnival in town. One of the carnival workers, a strong man in fact, got a little beard up with something, was put into jail. Well, the carnival left that night, and they hooked up their little truck they had into the bars, pulled out one side of the wall, and freed their strong man that time. Then in 1924, Dan Bowie was named governor, and he swore that every secret organization would either have to reveal the members of their organization or would have to disband. The Ku Klux Klan, very active in Baytown, a lot of them at that time, and a little bit active, but much more secretive, decided they'd hold a final torchlight parade, and so they did right up North Goose Creek Street. And Mom told us, you kids stay on the porch, and you can watch from there. There may be trouble out on the streets. So we stood. I was peeking around my mother's skirt, of course, about 6 years old, and it was very spooky seeing all of those torches and the pointed hats and the sheets moving down the street in the final Ku Klux Klan parade. And then there was a flood, and you've probably seen the old 1926 flood that occurred here from just a rainstorm is all it was. But Charlie Nell and I were phoned up at, Mom phoned at Aston Jones and said, get him on the railroad, let my son bring him home. Well, we came down as far as where North Main crosses Texas Avenue, and it was just a solid lake of water, nothing but the railroad above the water. And we going to have to play a little bit. We stayed pretty dry after then, so we got down and decided to walk there. Well, where the Baytown Chamber of Commerce is today was an old mobile Magnolia station. And Charlotte and I were walking along, we were cutting through the station driveway, and I just disappeared and came up a blob of oil. I'd fallen into the oil sump, which that time I remember a pit. There's like a pit, and then around the car over, drain the oil, and it kept overflowing away, and I fell in the pit. Then we moved to Ohio Street. Now that was downtown living. We moved to lots of, we're selling from anywhere from $550 to $800. You had your own concrete alleys, your curb and gutter, your asphalt streets, your storm sewers, your sewage line, everything really. Sidewalks for skating. It was downtown. And so we moved over to Ohio Street there. And we had a telephone. And you may not believe this, but we would be set as much as 2 and 3 blocks from a long distance call King. An operator, the central would just wait. It was always a death message. And one of us kids would be sent to bring that person to answer that phone. And that'd be 5, 8, 10 minutes. I would like to keep central waiting 10 minutes a day. What would it cost you? But I guess because there were 9 kids in our family, they could send us as runners to phone the Webber house. We did a lot. And I've been as much as 3 blocks to get people to come to the phone. We had an old Atmore Kent radio with the big old horn on the top, and along came the Dipsy Toonie fight, 1928. And my brother Joe and I wanted to listen to it, but everybody on the block, every adult man on the block had filled our living room. We couldn't get in there. So we just decided we'd go down to O.L. Nelson's house down the next block. He had the other only radio, and he turned it up a little so we could listen on his front porch and hear the Dipsy Toonie fight. One night I was coming home from First Baptist Church over on Kentucky Street, and skipped out of church, just finished training union and headed home real fast. And no lights in the Webber house. Well, that just wasn't possible. Not with 11 people. Sure somebody's there. I started to turn on the light and came in and said, leave it off. We're listening to a spook show. And sit down and just listen. Well, the part I heard was that the announcer was saying there's just little floating of green smoke as the last Martians are dying. It was Orson Welles' War of the Worlds. And we were having a big time enjoying it, and I was so surprised the next day when I heard that people in New Jersey were escaping from the whole state and phoning the state police and everything else. I thought the landing had really been made. It was that realistic. But all through that thing, they said this is just a radio play. And you can hear it today. They still have it. I bet you have it on tape here. The War of the Worlds, Orson Welles' presentation. I heard the New London disaster. Oh, that shook me to the roots when that big New London school, which was using natural gas right out of the field with no smell to it. And it got in the basement and blew the roof up and then down, crashed the lives out of 180 to 200 children, I believe. A tremendous disaster. Sitting one time about May of 35, and I heard that Wiley Post and Will Rogers had crashed at Point Barrow on their way around the world. Oh, Will Rogers was a wonderful person. All he'd have to do, Gulf, you would hear at the beginning of 30 minutes, Gulf Oil Corporation presents Will Rogers. And at the end of the 30 minutes, Gulf Oil Corporation has presented Will Rogers. That's all they needed to say. They got all the advertising they needed. He had the other 29 minutes. He had an alarm clock there. He listened to say, well, the alarm clock about to go off and had to quit. But a very wonderful monologue meeting. A world travel sailor one time was on NBC National hookup of some kind, and he said, I've traveled for many years on all over the world. I've been to Singapore, I've been to Hong Kong, I've been everywhere. And they said, well, tell us, we'd like to know, what's the toughest port in the world? And he shocked us. He said, Baytown, Texas. I can tell you why, but my neighbor out was Harbor Street from 32 to 35. Rough. I've seen killings, and I've seen brains stomped out and a few things like it. It was something a 13-year-old should have seen. But it was a rough port. Mr. Smalling and his two boys, Joe and me, and took us over in 1932 to see the brand new USS Cruiser Houston. Now, that's not the one that was manned in 1944. That was the second Cruiser Houston. First Cruiser Houston was some, I don't know whether it was Midway or one of the big. And they built a new cruiser Houston and outfitted it with Houston personnel. But this was the first cruiser Houston. Then too, about 1935 or 6, I was out there near the docks and watching the USS Constitution, old Ironsides, make its way up the ship channel very carefully because the Houston Light and Power lines might strike the mast. But they cleared it by about 2 feet. I think they put a little lead ballast in the Constitution so it would clear it. And that was quite a sight to see. There was a wildcat strike called by a man named Robert Oliver, the little CIO union in 1936, decided that their 45 members, they would declare a strike against the Humble Refinery. Now, this wasn't the Exxon refinery, this is good old John Humble. And I mean, there were blood ties. And old Frank Hamer and One-Eye Gonzalez were a couple of the Texas Rangers. Frank Hamer, you won't remember, some of the old timers might remember, he's the one who set up the ambush for Clyde Barron and Bonnie Parker. It was in Louisiana, but they let the Texas Rangers come over there and arrange it. And they riddled that car with about 156 bullets. I saw it later here in Baytown. But anyhow, those were quite some characters here. And then the goons came from the Longshoremen's Union over in Houston to be on the side of the strikers. So about 11:45, well, before that, my dad said, son, come out, ride with me out to Cedar Valley area. He took his .45 pistol and he said, I'm going to fire out all the old bullets I have here. I'm going to load it up. Tomorrow I'm going to have a shoulder holster and I am going through the refinery gates. He said, no one's going to keep me from my job. And that's the way people felt. It was a fierce situation in Baytown. And about 11:45 that night, the small little union decided to call off the wildcat strike. Well, like I say, I could go on and on, but so many things. I have told this before. If you were at Baytown Junior High, relaying of the cornerstone, but dear Swab over here said he'd like me. No, not Pierce Swab, Mr. Swab would like me to tell it again, I will. In 1928, February 1928, B.C. Morgan was going to dedicate the brand new cornerstone laying at the brand new Baytown Junior High building. It was going to be named James Hogg Junior High. In fact, written on the drawing that the, excuse me, well, can't think what they're called, the people who do the drawings, architecture, was James Hogg Junior High. But they just named one James Hogg in Houston, so we decided we'd better call it Baytown Junior High. That's the reason we came there. Anyhow, at that dedication that day, Mr. Morgan said he just read about Eastland County having torn open an old cornerstone. It was just sealed tight as it could be, and out came an old sleepy horned frog. Apparently, it had been in some kind of stupor of sleep through 48, 50 years. So he said, I'm going to put a horned frog in here. He got out a little cigar box. And if any of you are alive, I won't be, but if any of you kids out here are alive, when this cornerstone is open. I want you to see if that frog is still alive. Well, he's a good Baptist deacon and everything, so I knew he was going to do it, and I went on home. Rosetta Tart, his little granddaughter, began to shed 11-year-old tears and said, Grandpa, you're not going to put that frog in there. Surely, it'll die for sure. So he didn't. But here, I waited all these years. I get to see this. And sure enough, something did happen. A terrible thing happened. It was burned up. And when when Exxon decided to give back the cornerstone, I was right out there at White Cemetery with Krishak, cutting it, chiseling it out. I was sure that inside there we'd find an horned frog. No horned frog. I didn't know what Rosetta had done to her grandfather. All those years I lived with that horned frog. But the old roads, I remember she mentioned Captain George. Captain George also took care of the pontoon bridge across Goose Creek. Now, folks, you don't have any idea. There was no Market Street to 31. There was no road to Pelly with that bridge until 34. So what we did was go down Durang Road, which was cut off from Utah, and head down and go along the banks of Goose Creek, and then we go across a little pontoon bridge. Captain George had a fish house on the other side, and if he heard the toot of a tug, he knew he was coming to Kilgore Shipyard with some Kilgore Shell Yard with some barges of shell. So he would pull the old pontoon bridge over the side. Here we come with the barges. And of course, we went along the other side, and we came out about where the dog pound and the sewage plant is over on the other side, and then went on to Middletown. It wasn't headed in Middletown. And of course, when we lived on James Street, we lived in Newtown. But that's another story. I appreciate this opportunity, and like I told Audrey, where to stop is the biggest problem.
We could all enjoy a sequel and hear more. It's all so interesting. Sylvia McKinney is another retired teacher, and I think she taught some of our panelists, and she has fond memories of early days in Goose Creek.
I don't know that I need this mic. I'm afraid I don't. This is a first for me. This is a first pioneer affair I've ever attended. Even though I will be 74 years old Friday, I have never attended anything pioneer. My excuse has been all these years that I was entirely too young to be a pioneer. But I decided that 74 years fully qualified me, and that if I should wait until I'm 75, it might be too late. I might be overqualified and may not be able to be here at all. So I am joyfully glad to be here tonight, particularly on a panel with two of my students, Ailene Reineke and Ernestine Bright. I think I sort of pick up where you left off about your father. My father moved here in 1917, and I haven't been here so long that I don't have memories. And I remember moving from Oklahoma to this, what my mother liked to refer to as a jumping off place. And indeed, in 1917 it was. It was truly a movie type oil boom town, and everything that goes with it was here. I'm so much of a pioneer now that I was here before radio. I was here before television, penicillin, antibiotics. I was here before frozen foods, pantyhose, dishwashers, and air conditioning. And the next few lines I borrowed from someone else that I heard somewhere, but they fit my age and time. In my early days, cigarette smoking was fashionable, grass was mowed, Coke was something you drank, and pop was something you cooked in. I remember in 1917 there were 4 doctors in Baytown. My father was one of them, Dr. Lawson Hankins. I remember the wooden derricks in the field. It looked like a forest of derricks to me as a little girl. I remember the mud streets. Main Street in Pelly was every street was mud. I remember seeing oxen teams with the wagons behind, maybe 4 oxen to a wagon, pulling the heavy haul equipment down into the field on the main street of Pelly. I remember the board sidewalks. I remember the shootings and the stabbings and the oil field accidents that went on in the oil boom town. And the doctors, the few doctors worked very hard. Their offices were open almost around the clock to take care of the stabbings and the shootings and the accidents. There was no such thing as an office hours. I remember the blowouts, the gushers, the oil went all the way to wherever. And I could remember standing and watching it. It was a fantastic thing for me as a child. I also remember the oil well fires. That was even better. And my father, being a doctor, always had to go. And when his car started, I was always in it. And he would park me back at a safe distance and then walk on over to the fire. And they would burn sometimes 2 or 3 days, maybe longer. There was no red air then. People in Cedar Valley said they could read a newspaper when we had an oil well fire. I remember the dreadful flu epidemic of 1918 after World War I. It was my first introduction to death. There was a dance hall between Wilkinfield and Main Street in Pelly, and they made a hospital out of that. And the Army sent in cots. So many people were ill and dying. And there were rows and rows and rows of cots in this big dance hall. And I went right on in there, in the middle of it all. I remember the drinking water was purchased by the barrel. And it sat right outside of the back door, and you kept a wooden lid on top of the barrel. I believe it was $1.25 a barrel. I remember a place also on South Main, between Wilkinfield and Pelly, a place they called Tent City. And this was, I presume, thrown up overnight, I don't know, to take care of the families, whole families that came in by the dozens or whatever every day to seek their fortune from the black gold that was flowing down there. In the summertime, these tents had dirt floors, and in the winter, they had mud floors, but the people didn't seem to mind. But after all, wages were terrifically high. I imagine, I sort of feel like they thought what they had, and made the money. I remember when the railroad was built, and we had a railroad station. Ross Sterling and Associates needed that spur from Dayton to Goose Creek to bring in the equipment to build the refinery. I remember the white schoolhouse that stood on the corner where the Jewish synagogue is today, Sterling and Commerce. And I started the first grade right there, and they only had 8 grades for a long while, and then some years later they opened up the YMCA for high school grades. But I went right straight through first grade through high school. I graduated here. I graduated from the old Goose Creek High School. My class was 1928. It was the last class to graduate from Goose Creek High School. And we had 15 teachers, 273 students, and 25 graduates that year, the largest class to ever graduate from Goose Creek High School. I never did get that big school they built way out of town on top of a hill that was Robert E. Lee. I never did have the pleasure to go there. 3 years later, I graduated from Baylor University and came back and was teaching school at age 19. And so I have students as old as 70 years old. Now, Ernestine and Ailene do not fit that 70-year-old category, as you well know. But they are here, and maybe not in this building, but I will not tell you they are. I'd love to tell it, but they might not like to hear me say that. I started a teaching career here in 1932, and this lasted a period of 45 years. And I retired in 1977. So I've been retired almost as long as I taught, it seems. I've got you up to 1932, and I'm going to turn it over to Ernestine, one of the children who are here. But I do have memories, many of them. And, of course, they're precious roots for me.
Panelist is Ernestine Bright, who works here at the library and who remembers the early days of Goose Creek.
I'm sure I'm glad she said Goose Creek, because I have a good friend on the back row, and she says, now they printed that wrong. They said growing up in Baytown. Said you didn't grow up in Baytown, you grew up in Goose Creek. I was born and reared on the east side of Goose Creek, not just Goose Creek, but at that time we were considered to live on the east side of Goose Creek. I was born in 1924, and my parents were Ernest Moore and Pauline Armour Moore. And if I could get my mother just to stand up, I'd like to introduce her, because she's the matriarch of our family. Okay, I would like to tell you that my daddy came here in 1921. He brought my mother here from Waller County as a bride, and they bought a house on East James. We lived just a couple of blocks down from the Webbers, and I didn't know it until I read it in the paper. But my mother knew it. She said that my daddy worked with his daddy. They were both Boilermakers. Daddy was one of the first employees at the new Humble Oil and Refining Company. And in those days, the Boilermakers built their tanks in a different way from what they do today. I remember my daddy coming in from work many a time, so hot and tired and dirty, and he'd say that he'd been heating and tossing rivets all day, or he'd say he'd been catching rivets, or he'd say he'd been bucking rivets. It seemed like that there was a three-man team that worked together to build the tanks. I was hoping that Mr. I.L. Jelly Johnson would be here tonight, because I was going to introduce him, because he was one of my daddy's working partners. But his daughter is here, that's Lee Shea in the back. And when I'm talking about Lee, she and I used to be in the Rainbow Girls together. We went to the old Masonic Lodge in Cedar Bayou. It seems like so many things that have been said tonight are connections of things that have happened in my life. Okay, my mother and daddy built a house at 414 East James in 1928. They had bought a small house in that same lot, on that same lot, but then when the children started coming along, well, they realized that house wasn't big enough, and so they tore that house down and built a larger house on the same lot. And my mother still lives at, well, it was 414 East James, but a few years later they changed the numbering system, and it's 214 East James. Must have been a good house, because they raised 6 kids in it, and we always had a lot of company at our house, so it stood out to all of the racket. And one of my oldest friends is here tonight, Martha Dobson Dial Smith. And she so graciously came over to my house, and she helped me reminisce. Raise your hand, Martha. Because Martha was the one that helped me reminisce, and she may have brought some of her pictures. I brought my pictures. But anyway, she'd say something like this, that, Ernestine, do you remember the circus that would come to town? Said they would walk those animals right past our house. Martha's house, I thought, was out in the country. Let me tell you this. She lived on East James too, but she lived a half a block from where Highway 146 is. And to me, that seemed like it was out in the country because they had pasture across the street. And I'm going to get back to that in a minute. But anyhow, let's go back to the circus. She and I were reminiscing, so I asked Mother about it too. And they said, yes, the circus train would stop at the intersection of Commerce and East James, and they would walk the animals right past our house to get to the circus ground. And they would set the circus tent up close to where Highway 146 is now in East James, or sometimes they would move it over to Texas Avenue and where 146 is. And once I remember where it was set up on East Vale. But anyway, we were so excited and afraid too when we'd see the elephants walk down the street. And my mother would get us all up on the front porch, and she'd tell us to be very quiet and not to do anything to make the animals stampede. And it was especially frightening to see the lions and the tigers in their cages just going right down past our house. Not many kids today have that experience. Another thing that we remembered were the tent revivals. Do you remember the tent revivals? They would put straw on the floor, on the ground, and they'd have an awful lot of loud music, and they'd have different instruments besides pianos, and an awful lot of loud singing, and happy people. They're clapping their hands and stomping their feet, and Martha and I just joined right in with them. We had a good time. It was not only a time of worship, but it was also a time of fellowship and visiting with our friends. Another thing we remembered were the medicine shows. It seems that they also put the medicine shows up close to, we called it Goose Creek Street. It was, instead of North Main Street, it was Goose Creek Street back at that time. Goose Creek Street, and close to Commerce or right in that area, they would set up the medicine show stages. Well, we enjoyed that a lot because we would get to see slapstick comedy, and we would see some blackface comedy, and we would see men that would get up there on the stage, and they would sell their tonics and their salves, and they would let the little boys, boys about 10 or 12 years old in the audience, deliver their products out among the people. And then those boys would collect the money and run back up to the stage with it. And one time we remember a wedding that took place right on the stage at the medicine show. It was somebody from our neighborhood, and that caused quite an excitement for quite a while. And of course, I'm surprised nobody has really talked about going to Evergreen to go swimming, because that was the highlight of our summers. Mother and Daddy would load us in the Model A Ford, and we would go down Tri-City Beach Road to Evergreen Road, and then when we got there, well, Daddy would stop the car because there was a dipping vat there. Now, he wasn't going to dip us, but he let us watch the people, the farmers and ranchers, dip their cattle. And then sometimes we'd take our dogs and we'd give our dogs a good dipping in the dipping bag. And then Daddy would do us a favor, or maybe we were doing him Mother a favor, but he would let some of us older kids stand on the running board of the car, and we'd drive slowly down Evergreen Road down to the swimming area. And we enjoyed swimming there, and one reason why was because the bottom of the bay had a real nice firm sand, because there were a lot of places along the bay that was soft and squishy. And whenever we got to an area that was real soft and squishy, we'd put on our tennis shoes because we just didn't like that feel. And then another thing that we enjoyed about the bay was to get to go floundering. Daddy was an outdoor sportsman besides working at the refinery. Well, he did a lot of hunting and fishing. And he also trapped muskrats. And he would go to the cove area to trap muskrats. And he would bring the hides home, and he would dry them and stretch them. And they would smell so good. I don't know if you've ever smelled a muskrat hide, but it smells exactly like musk perfume does today. I don't know what they make musk perfume out of, but I think it must be part muskrat. And the last thing, I was going to get back to Martha's pasture. We used to play out in that pasture, and we would pick the wildflowers. They had some wild violets. And Myrtle Louise Moore Grimes, well, Myrtle Louise Grimes Moore, lived next door to Martha, and so she knows what I'm talking about. They had the beautiful violets in that field. And then across, a little bit further out into that pasture was a pond. And my brother Paul and Martha's brothers, Jack and Harold, and Kenny Ford, and all of those boys, incidentally, are doctors now. Dentists are doctors. And they used to go crawfishing out there at that pond. There were a lot of crawfish in that pond. And the boys would bring all of those crawfish home to Mother, and she would cook them. And I don't remember any of us girls eating the crawfish, but the boys loved them. And there was another place out where Danny Bennett Acres is now, and that's where my brother used to like to hunt. Now, I have a younger brother back there, but he is too young to be in the old-timey part because there's 20 years difference in the oldest and the youngest in our family, and there's 10 years difference in the two youngest. And so, Jerry and I want you to feel left out because he just happened to come along kind of late in my mother's life. But anyway, we just always had real good times as kids. But anyway, I want to tell you one more thing before I quit. I want to tell you about the summer recreational programs that we had at Asheville Smith School. That was the most fun during the summer, was to get to go to Asheville Smith to learn their crafts. And they had volleyball teams and they had softball teams. And there were enough kids in our neighborhood so that we didn't have to go to other campuses to play, that we just had a lot of teams right there in our neighborhood, and we just challenged each other. And if something should happen that we didn't have enough for a full team, we'd play workup. And like that, we'd get to play every position on the field. And as I was doing the research on this, well, my friend said, Ernestine, did you know that your mother and my mother, this is Miss Dobson I'm talking about, were the instigators of the summer recreation program? It said that there had been some vandalism at the school, and the boys were breaking the windows out. And so they went to the school board, and they said, if you will just give us permission, well, we will start a summer recreation program, and we will be the volunteers. We will teach these children the crafts, and we will work at the school ground. But said, we need you to give us permission, and we need to use your facilities, and we need you to buy the equipment, and we'll do it. And that's what they did. And this is the first time I knew that my mother had anything to do with it. But they went to the PTAs, and the PTAs went to the school board as a unit, and so they had some influence. Well, I'm going to quit right there. There are a lot of other things I could say now. I have a lot of slides that I could show, but I'm not going to show but about 6 of them right now because we're running out of time. But those of you that were in my graduating class, I see a lot of you here tonight, a lot of my old friends. I have pictures of most of you on these slides right here. And maybe when we have our 45th class reunion this year, maybe some of you will come and look at my slides, because I've got 80 of them and I don't want to waste them. Okay, I'm going to show you a few. Okay. That's me when I was a baby in 1924. And the girl with the dark hair is Ailene Corn. She lived next door to Martha, and I chose that picture because you can tell that there were not many houses out East James past where Highway 146 is. I think there were just 3 houses on out east of there till we got to Cedar Bible. And that's the first 5 of us children. And this is the original First Baptist Church that today is Memorial Baptist. It was on the corner of Texas and I believe 2nd Street. East Texas and 2nd Street. And later, a few years later, well, it was a new church was built on Pierce. And this is my Uncle Victor Cook's electric show.